You are hanging out on the beach. A bottle washes up on shore. You, for some inexplicable reason, start rubbing it, and a genie pops out. But the only wishes you can ask for are changes to the guidelines, and you can't ask for the guidelines to be done away with altogether. What and so I'm gonna give you three wishes, but even if you want to just tell me your top wish, if you had that bottle, what would it be?
I wish that the genie had a better life than to only be able to grant guideline wishes. Because I'm sorry, as genies go, that's a pretty crappy genie life.
Well, it's my hypothetical, Professor.
And I loved it. I loved it.
Over 1 million Americans face sentencing every year, and it will be the most important day of their lives. But we don't fully understand the system, how broken it is, and what we can do to make it better. I'm Doug Passon. I'm a 25-year criminal defense lawyer and a sentencing expert. My goal is to bring more awareness, more fairness, and more humanity to the sentencing process. So, are you ready? Then let's get set for sentencing.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to, well, we'll call this the 2025 guidelines wrap up and 2026 guidelines kickoff, all rolled into one. A very special edition episode of Set for Sentencing. Why is it special, you may ask? Besides the fact that we're talking about the guidelines, which is always so special to me in my heart. Well, it's special because we have a very special guest. Welcome back to the podcast, Professor Doug Berman from The Ohio State University. Hello. How are you?
I am very well. Thank you for having me, Doug. Good to see you and be here.
Oh, good to have you back. I will tell you about Professor Berman in a second, but I also want to let our listeners know that we have our great friend and colleague Mark Allenbaugh back here too, because no discussion about federal sentencing guidelines could ever meaningfully occur without him. So welcome back to your home away from home here at Set for Sentencing.
Thank you, Doug.
I have done a lot of research to prepare for this episode because my guests are so formidable. So the first bit of research is that, if you've ever seen and listened to the podcast, you know that I put a lot of thought into what kind of tequila I'm going to drink in any particular episode. Now, I don't always drink tequila, but, on a Saturday afternoon, I feel like it's important. Plus, the guidelines drive me to drink. But anyway, so I try to put a lot of thought and it's very thematic. So I'm going to give either of my guests an opportunity to decide why I picked this, which is one of my favorite tequilas called G4. Anybody? Anybody? G4? Want to guess the
G4.
tie-in?
G4.
I'm pouring it
Well,
right now.
it looks like it's a Blanco.
It is a Blanco. I know you're not
Yeah.
a big Blanco fan.
No.
Just stick. Anybody? Professor
I don't know.
Berman?
I
Any
don't know.
guesses?
I
All
could come
right.
up with lots of bad guesses, but why don't you give us the right thing?
Well, I won't keep you in suspense. So I was in Vegas last weekend and I was meeting some of my old law school friends for a little weekend fun and I actually had a monumentous event. I made my first sports bet at the
Oh,
Oh,
sports
hey.
book and it was on a
Nice.
football game and
Great.
my alma mater, Indiana University, was playing. Oh my God, who was on? I can't. Oh, that's right. They were playing Ohio State, and
Uh,
four was the spread on the
ah,
game.
yeah.
So it was a 4 point spread. And of course, I bet on my alma mater, IU, and the two guys I was with, traitorous wretches that they were, bet on Ohio State, and I walked out with a nice handful of cash. So I don't know why I was thinking, oh, that's right, because Professor Berman is a distinguished law professor at The Ohio State University. And Mark, I don't want to leave you out of this because I know you love stats. So here's a pop quiz. When was
yeah.
the last year? Maybe maybe Doug knows this too. When was the last year IU won a Big Ten championship?
Oh, I think it was before any of us were born. It was back in the 60s. I want to say 63 or something like that.
Professor Berman.
I thought it was 1950, something like that, but early late 40s maybe. But you tell us.
I'll give you a hint. It's the kids, the young people's favorite two numbers these days.
Oh, six,
Oh,
seven.
67.
Six
Wow.
six seven, baby.
That
Okay.
hot reference. Well, at the risk of not wanting to be a bad omen for Indiana, my favorite neighbor state, I might say, here in Ohio, we lost to Michigan 13-10 last year, and
Interesting.
things haven't worked out so great for them since then.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
No
so
kidding.
I hope it's not the same,
I
forecast
see.
for our 13-10 loss to Indiana. But that was a
Interesting.
nice little
Neato.
game.
Neato. Well, we're making predictions about guidelines, so why not make predictions about football?
I love it. No,
Anyway,
it's the kind of
I
guest
could
treatment I look forward to. So
I could keep going with this. But here's one more stat. It's actually a very interesting one. When is the last time that IU beat Ohio State in football? The last
that,
year.
that may be even longer ago, but again, I'm not sure about that one.
It was not longer ago. It was my very first semester
Mm,
at
Oh,
Indiana University, 1988.
88.
wow.
There
Yeah.
you go. Very
So there
well.
we go. Okay. So now,
Okay.
now, now that we've gotten that out of the way, here we go. I want to talk about, okay, let's see. So, as I said, I'm so happy to have you back, Professor Berman. And I want to make sure you are a returning guest. You've been here before, but I do want to make sure that the listeners know a little bit about you. So, Doug Berman is the Newton D. Baker, Baker and Hostetler Chair in Law and Executive Director of the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center at The Ohio State University, Moritz College of Law. And among many of his accomplishments and writings and achievements there and contributions to the criminal justice world, he is the creator of the acclaimed blog Sentencing Law and Policy. It's a blog, but it's really more like a Bible for anyone trying to keep their
In a,
finger.
in a new location, I have to say now, the
Yeah.
TypePad hosting service expired in September of this year, much to my chagrin, and so found a new WordPress home. But you shouldn't have any problem finding it if you look around, and I
Um,
appreciate you saying nice
now,
things about it. But that's it.
wait a
That's
minute.
it.
Now that I think about it, I haven't been getting any emails from you.
There you
Did,
go. So you need to you
people
need to
don't?
find the site and sign up, and I will
Oh,
add the fact that it happened to be just about 21 years I was at TypePad before it. So I'm kind of thinking they went out drinking and blacked out, and so did my site, and so that's
does
why
that
I'm a
mean
new.
you lost your whole subscribership? Like they have to find you again somewhere else?
They do
Oh
indeed.
man,
That's
that's
that's how it goes. I had before it blew up, I had a couple, redirects and things like that. And my sense is it's not that hard to find me, but it has been among the things that have made this year
God.
interesting. And appreciate having a chance to plug the new home here, and
Oh my
happy to have
gosh.
visitors visitors come on by. There's more pictures now in the new format as well. And
Okay.
if you like images, you get even more of them now.
Well, I will absolutely put that link in the show notes. So anybody
Thank
who's
you.
listening to the podcast, go to setforsentencing.com and look at the notes for this episode. The links will be right there. We got to get all your people back.
Yeah.
That sucks. You've spent a decade or more building up this amazing following and they just poofed. I think
Yes,
we
and,
got to
and
sue
you
those
know,
people.
in a mini version of this, and I hope this never happens to the podcast, but for a while, folks had been giving me the indication that you'd probably be wise to change locales because this typepad service looked like it was declining and was not going to be around forever. And I was like, well, I stick with the brand and all of that, and then we got a notice in August saying, yeah, we're shutting down in a month, and good luck, good luck, and we'll see you. And so that led to a lot of scrambling among a lot of folks who have been blogging on that service for a long time, and we all sort of found new places to be. And I also now do a Substack, so that's another thing to promote as well with
Oh,
Jonathan
okay.
Wroblewski and Steve Chanenson, and we get some
Oh,
other
okay.
folks writing there. And in fact, it's an open invitation to both of you if you want to write there about the guidelines or anything else. We're always
Oh,
trying
okay.
to
Great.
cultivate voices there as well. So plenty of
Amazing.
places to scream into the wind, as it were, on the internet. Thank God. So not so
Wow.
big deal.
Let's talk about guidelines. So what we're going to do is a really quick recap of what happened, and the reason we're quick
Yeah.
because we've done We've done several podcasts over the year about the new guideline amendments that took effect November 1st, 2025. So let's hit a couple of the biggies. Supervised release, we'll start there. What do we need to
Yeah.
know about that? Supervised release. And for anyone who doesn't know what supervised release is, it's like probation, but it comes after you've served a term in the Bureau of Prisons. So you get some time in custody, followed by some period of supervision. In my experience, judges were very keen on this. And even though the law said they had to give at least a year, it was usually 2 or 3 years, sometimes more,
Yeah.
depending on the case. And easy for some and really difficult for others, but it's kind of been the bane of our existence for many, many years. So, what's the
Yeah.
change?
It's not the default anymore. At least according to the commission, the commission has changed the guidelines, that section of the guidelines dealing with supervised release, to encourage judges to make an individualized assessment. Basically, is supervised release really necessary for the defendant in front of you, as opposed to a default? So that's huge. So now defendants may not get it and can argue for not having supervised release. And those that
Okay.
do get it, the great part is that now the commission encourages early termination,
Yeah.
and you can apply for early termination after 1 year being on supervised release, regardless of how
Yeah.
long you've been given it. And so that's good. One of the things, though, that everybody should be aware of, that Doug, you and I are seeing a lot of this, is if you are not given at least a year of supervised release, you're not eligible for First Step Act credits. So that can result in you
Yeah.
serving longer in prison.
Yeah. Yeah. You got
So
it
you
for
always want
some.
at least a year,
Yeah.
is the point. Yeah.
Okay. Well, and I don't think, well, just for the record, because my question is, it's only been on the books for a little over a month.
Correct.
I know that we've had one case so far where we've made the motion to early terminate and
Yeah.
cited to the new provision, and we were successful.
Right.
And so I'm just wondering, do we have any broader sense of how this is playing out and whether judges are going to unmore? Because in my opinion, this is very much
Yeah.
like when Booker happened. Like judges were set. This is what we do. This is how we do
Yeah.
it, and that's a nice little change that's out there. But this is what I'm going to stick to. So I'm just wondering, do we have any sense of how the judge, how meaningful this change is going to be when the judges have the discretion?
Yeah. Well, and the answer is no. I mean, we won't know
Too soon.
until, yeah, and we won't know until next fiscal year, when the commission publishes its data. And I hope the commission is starting to collect new variables. For example, like, when is early termination given? If they could start collecting that, that would be very helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, and I think this is where there's going to be a combination of challenges with both the advocates as well as the judges, because I think thinking about defense attorneys, thinking about prosecutors, they've gotten so used to, supervised release is there. And as Mark highlighted, and I think it's an important thing to highlight in terms of thinking about initial sentencing and maybe plea deals as well, there are certainly certain judges for whom having a significant supervised release term may make them feel comfortable giving a shorter prison term. And so, the relationship between those two, it's going to be very judge specific. And again, I think experienced defense attorneys and experienced prosecutors are so used to having supervised release be the default, and
Right.
maybe even thinking it's a really good thing that like you say, Doug, I think it's very much like Booker. It's going to take some time and likely might be different for the newer judges, that they're more comfortable with the new world order that the commission is putting forward. I also hope, if the data shows that there isn't as much of a change as I think would be appropriate in light of what the commission's done, that the commission really invest in trying to educate judges and advocates more, that
Mhm.
this is based in good science, so to speak, right? This is part of a broader movement we've been seeing, across the criminal justice spectrum in states as well, that these long tail supervisions just cause more problem for folks than focusing only on the people who really need to be supervised. And so, it's
Yeah.
something that I hope is going to be a continued priority for the commission. And we might talk long-term vision, especially if they lose a quorum, which is a possible
Yeah.
reality not too long from now, that maybe they'll even do more to focus on, okay, we've made a bunch of changes. Let's really make sure they get implemented right, because that's always
Hmm.
a long-term challenge.
Why is it possible that they might lose a quorum? I had not heard about that.
Well, they've already lost two members who have timed out that we've not yet seen the Trump administration put up any nominees. And there seems to be kind of a disinterest or just, even though we got lots of litigation over President Trump's ability to change personnel in other branches, the
Appointments
sentencing
clause.
Yes, the Sentencing Commission has been kind of left out of that, which may be a very good thing. And notably, the
Hmm.
Sentencing Commission is the only agency that's in the judicial branch. So there's some technical legal arguments that might change his ability to really change people around. But right now, he could appoint two new members because there's two vacancies. And I believe it's after this next cycle of amendments that we'll be talking about, we will have two more members time out. That would take us down to only three members if we don't get
Yeah.
new appointments confirmed, and that would mean they couldn't pass any amendments because three
Right.
Right.
is the core
Right.
four they need.
Yeah.
Which would be so unfortunate because we spent so much time in that limbo years, right? And
Right.
then they finally got up and running and a lot of really meaningful changes. I'd hate to
Although,
see that come to an end. I'm going to
uh,
nominate the two of you.
well, to finish the thought, you won't be surprised to hear there are some in the defense bar who think it's just fine that the current administration isn't actively trying to fill the seats that are left empty, and that having a commission that's unable to do stuff because Trump hasn't filled in all the vacancies may be the best of all possible worlds. Now, again, we've got midterms not too far away. There's lots of moving
Yeah.
parts here to sort of figure out what that might look like. But I think it's one of the things that as
Yeah.
we're forecasting, and I bring it up especially because I know we're not quite ready to look at the latest amendment cycle, but I perceive the current commission may be trying to do more this cycle with a potential eye on that they might not have another cycle to come to get stuff done.
Yeah.
Well, anybody who's ever heard me go off on politics and things like that knows that I'm not always a fan, but this is one area where I think that's misguided from Defense Bar. I think if you can give any credit to this administration, the last go around, and this time's a little more up in the air, but I have more confidence on criminal justice issues, especially on the white collar guidelines. I mean,
Yeah.
who knows what kind of beautiful things, and we're going to talk about that because we
Yeah.
have changes to the lost guide. But here's one
Yeah.
of the reasons I'm so excited to have you on the podcast to talk about what happened this year, Professor Berman, is because there was, I don't know if I'd call it a seismic shift, but a pretty significant change, which is the elimination of all downward departures. And we did a whole podcast on this. But what I'm really interested is just to hear, what are your thoughts on this and how do you think this is going to play out? Because if you remember our conversations in the past, this sort of hints around the edges of the big debate that we always have, which is, are these guidelines even worth having at all? And your position has always been having them is better because it's the devil and if you remove all of these guidelines and it's a free for all, you're never going to know what happens. And to me, this sort of is a smaller subplot of that larger story. But give me your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. Lots of thoughts, can't capture them all. I do think there's the what's good in theory and then what's been going on in practice. I think in theory, getting rid of departures was not a great thing because it's just more guidance to judges based on what had all sorts of nuance and history to it that were imperfect, but still a useful thing that lawyers could look to, that we could generate data around, that provided some input to judges to further influence the way they thought about the formal guidelines and how they should be applied, or really how they should be departed from. So in theory, I wasn't so keen on getting rid of them. In practice, the vast majority of judges in the vast majority of cases were jumping over the departure step, going straight to variance, and to leave something in place that was sort of a zombie-like, you might say, and yet we didn't quite know, you know, in what courthouse, with what judges, under what cases would the zombie come alive and potentially eat up the discussion about sentencing. I get the instinct of let's just bury them, be done with them, and start building out a better guideline system. And I think that was really the core of what I was hoping for. And honestly, it's making me somewhat encouraged. One thing that I think was at the core of the way the guidelines have always functioned is everything aggravating would be written by the commission as an enhancement to drive up the guideline range, And then everything mitigating was kind of left to departures. And it was
Yeah.
really up to the advocates and the judge to be like, well, here are these mitigating factors, whatever they might be, and that's why I'm going below. Obviously, once the guidelines became advisory, it was easier for judges to feel comfortable doing that across a range of cases under 3553A, but still it was like that was the sort of the game in play. And what we're seeing, and it really started a couple years ago with the 0 point offender, where I get the sense this current commission sees, I think, a very justified obligation to now write more mitigating factors into the actual guidelines rather than just rely on departures as the way to capture those concerns. And so if one of the consequences of getting rid of departures means the commission is more committed to putting more mitigating factors into the actual guidelines, then I'm really keen on this was the right move, this was the right direction, and hopefully that will continue. Again, we see it a little bit in this latest round of guidelines, and I think it's something that should be more of a mandate for the commission now that they got rid of departures and can't think, well, we took care of that in our guidelines through these other kind of zombie-like creatures.
What's your take, Mark?
To continue Professor Berman's thought about data, as what I am worried about now that departures were removed is capturing all these reasons for variance. One of the big, the unsung hero of the commission, and you're not going to be surprised when I say this, happens to be its ability to capture and analyze sentencing data. That's supposed to inform the evolution of the guidelines. And now, without any departures, all that data that had been collected and analyzed on departures, it has disappeared in a sense. Now, the commission has come out with just last month a new statement of reasons, which is the primary vehicle that the commission uses to capture data, sentencing data. And basically, it's a little form that judges fill out to give a little précis of the sentence. And there's a part in there that includes all the reasons for a variance now, or the 3553A factors. Not surprisingly, those same factors are really the traditional grounds for a departure, but they may not be nuanced enough, or they may be a lot of the reasons in here may be irrelevant, and more importantly, there's a little section in there that allows the judge just to put in other.
Other.
Well, that other reason for a variance or a departure should have been captured a long time ago. And I'll put it this way: I am just disappointed that the commission did not use this opportunity to develop a more robust and nuanced statement of reasons. If it was going to get rid of all the departures, it should have spent some time educating judges and the public on the statement of reasons and why they are putting in, and why certain grounds remain in the statement of reasons, and how these new grounds will be developed,
Yeah.
and what methodology or criteria is the commission going to use. Just as a quick example, let's just say it's post-defense rehabilitation. That might be a reason for a variance. Well, how often does a court have to cite that before it becomes part of the actual document? And these are all issues that really should have been sorted out. And I feel like this was such a wholesale change that that happened, I think, too quickly, and it was not well thought out in this process. So I agree, though, that departures were becoming irrelevant, but from a data analytics perspective, they were very relevant, and that's kind of been ignored in this process.
Right. If data is the foundation that the guidelines were supposed to rest on, this seems like a very sloppy way to
sloppy
keep stats and figure out what.
Yeah.
Nobody knows, but my take is listen, it's why I say call this Studio 3553. That has always been my guiding star. And to me, this is more, at least tacit affirmation of the importance of those factors over the guidelines factors. So I'm happy about the two-step process. I'm not so worried about them giving the judges license to vary upward more, because the guidelines gave them all the license they needed.
Yeah,
and the stats are in our favor in terms of
right.
downward. And so, we'll have to see, but I think I think it's
And I'll,
okay.
and
But
I'll throw in an advocacy point just to kind of wrap it up, which is to say, I think not only is there no reason not to, but there's a strong reason to build arguments around the old departure factors, even today, if it's a good fit for a particular case, right? If there's a historic departure
Oh yeah,
factor that's now gone, the guidelines themselves haven't changed significantly enough to say, well, that's now old hat. This was something that the commission itself had said years
right,
ago. This wasn't adequately captured by our
sure,
guidelines. I think there's every basis to
sure,
argue, but then
right.
say the right way to do it, Judge, is a 35553A factor. And so,
yeah, yeah,
ideally, it can be used, as just another argument point when it's helpful, but then you don't waste time with it, especially if you have a judge who's, why are you giving me these departure arguments? Because, I don't bother with that anymore anyway.
yeah. No, I agree, and I think prosecutors will do that because they'll cling to the old regime and they'll just say, if you look at under 3553, the first thing we consider is nature and circumstances of the offense, and this was whatever, and I think that's fair game. I would do that too if there was a departure that was relevant to it. But what I think might be good is oftentimes whatever increase the guidelines recommends is too much. And
Yeah,
so maybe the bright shining star as a judge could say, yeah, I'm going to consider it, but they're not tied to any arbitrary, 4 level or 10 level or 20 level, whatever the case may be, like the terrorism enhancement, for example. So anywho, all right, well let's move to what is coming in 2026. So
yeah. Wow.
the commission is still working away, and there's some adjustments that are being proposed, and then
Major,
okay. So
major changes.
all right, well, I have a whole list that you've provided me.
Yeah.
Do you want to start with inflationary adjustments to
Well, yeah.
loss tables? That
This
doesn't sound
is
that major.
yeah.
Is
Right.
that major?
Well, I think I
How about
well
raise
it
the fucking minimum wage? That would be a really
yeah.
nice
Well, I
inflationary adjustment. Okay.
this is the sentencing guide, the fraud guideline at 2B 1.1 has always been it is developed into a monster, and it's kind of like a mini guideline in and of itself, and it has more SOCs than any other guideline, and they're very difficult to parse, and there's all these cross references, and one of the big issues, the big complaint has always been the loss table, and now over the last 20 years since Booker, the loss, I've written articles on this and done a lot of statistical analysis, that loss has become, even though it's the driving force behind the guidelines, behind how the guidelines are calculated, it is becoming less and less relevant. So what the commission is doing or is proposing to do is it's two things. One is to adjust the guidelines for inflation, big whoop, so to speak. And I say big whoop because nobody's following the guidelines anyway. So it's a little bit, to my mind, rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. But another thing that I like is that they're restructuring the loss table. And even though they're restructuring it, basically what the proposal is, as far as I can understand, is they're not going to have as many levels. The loss ranges are going to be a little bit broader. If I understand the proposal, it's a little nebulous to me. But nonetheless, I'm glad that they're looking at that. And if
Will
anybody at the
will it go
commission,
down? Will the level increase go down or no?
well, if they do both, if I'll put it this way, if they do both, they restructure the table and do the inflationary adjustment, $100,000 loss won't get you the same offense level as it does today. I'll put it that way. So
Okay.
100,000 or a million or 10 million
Yeah.
will go down. It
Huh?
just depends on where it is in that cusp. But I'm going to just throw this out there. If they're looking at what my big criticism of the commission since I was the staff attorney there is when they make adjustments, they do too many small ones, or if they do a big one, they do it too messy. They have a really good opportunity right now. If they're looking at the guidelines, anybody at the loss table, if anybody at the commission is watching this, do what California does. Have a low range, a mid range, and a high range, and that's it. I think what the commission is slowly coming to, where I see this trajectory going, is ultimately just getting not having loss so fine tuned that
Hmm.
it's like overly calibrated. And where do I
Interesting.
get that from? This is not my opinion per se. Well, it is my opinion, but I'm also getting that from the data, the way that the courts are treating the loss amount. As the loss amount increases uniformly every year, as the loss amount increases, the rate and degree of variance also increases, which means judges are they're considering that amount of loss less and less. It doesn't factor in to the sentence that they ultimately impose. So
I
now's the
think
time.
they should create another table here which correlates the loss amount with the amount that you have to pay to get your white collar crime pardoned by the current
Yeah.
administration.
Actually, Doug, just real quick, one other thing I'll say that I was disappointed in is this inflationary adjustment. They're looking to the CPI. Okay, now I that kind of that
Consumer Price Index.
the
I know
consumer,
what
excuse me.
CPI stands for, but I have no
Yes.
idea what that actually means.
Okay. Well,
What consumers pay for goods? Is this like inflation or something?
essentially it's a number. It's
Okay.
a number that the Bureau, I think it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics or something like that, puts out every year, and it's basically it's a measure of inflation. What is a dollar by today versus the purchasing power it had back in 1986 or something like that. And so it's a way to measure inflation. And so I understand why the commission would peg the loss table to the CPI, but it's irrelevant. What the commission should be pegging it to is what judges are doing with loss. So
Hmm.
forget the CPI thing. Look at the
Hmm.
data. How are judges? If judges are 80% of the time sentencing below the guideline range, where the loss range is between 150 and $250,000, then that tells you something about the
Yeah.
range. That
Yeah.
range needs to be adjusted. But
Well,
for what judges are doing, not the CPI.
I hope that the commission will be listening to this podcast
Yes.
in the new year. And if not, I think one or both of you need to go testify
Well,
and
yeah,
tell
the,
them.
the the good news is that these are a set of proposals, right? So we're just at the
Right.
stage where the commission is putting out proposals. And in fact, what's so helpful is historically they've talked about, working on the fraud guideline and done things that were much more in the tinkering mode. It looks like they're at least suggesting they're going to do something bigger with the loss table. But I
Yes.
think in harmony with Mark's conception of this, it's still dollar driven. And I
Yeah.
think, Doug, you were asking about, well, what does it really mean? It's not just dollar driven, it's also going to still be the bulk of what drives the guideline
Yeah.
calculation
Yeah.
in a way that is part of a
Mm.
more fundamental problem, which is
Yeah.
loss is a such an imperfect proxy, especially the way it's defined in the
Yes.
guidelines. This
Right.
actual or intended loss, whichever is greater, creates a mechanism in which, literally somebody just, puffing about they want to do a $20 million deal on this or that gets
Yeah.
treated exactly the same as somebody who's able to put $20 million in their pocket, and whether you're defrauding the government or the widows and orphans that we're more concerned about. Now, there are other components of the guidelines that try to pick up the nature of the victim, but ultimately it's been the focus on kind of an alchemy of dollar amount and that being such a big driver of the calculation that
Mm,
isn't
Yeah.
going to be changed fundamentally by what the commission is doing, but as sort of
right.
Mark puts it, because judges have gotten very comfortable, in a sense, disregarding the
Yes.
extent of the exacerbation that the loss amount creates. This is a little bit of huffing and puffing about a house that's already been blown down because, there's very little evidence that a lot of judges are letting a technical loss calculation eclipse their own concern about, well, really, how culpable is this guy? And really, how bad was this kind of fraud versus that kind of fraud? All of which is part of the nuances that we know well. There's just like these are often very different kinds of cases depending on who the defendant is, what the nature of the economic harm was, and then also what happens afterwards, which maybe is a little bit of acute to some of the stuff they're also doing, or at least proposing this cycle. If someone were to help get the money back, right? This is actually in the, I believe, the Sam Bankman-Fried setting, right, where it's like he has this huge loss calculation, but then
Yeah,
Bitcoin comes back and everybody ends up getting made whole. That just sort of feels very different than somebody
yeah,
who really, wipes out a bank or does something that has incredible economic harm long term. And so it's just a challenge of even calibrating this stuff and a guideline that has required judges to calibrate, but in an advisory world, they rightly sense there's a lot more to think about than just
yeah.
some number
Mm.
they can come up with on a spreadsheet.
Okay, so before I move to the next one, I do want to digress for a second because I did make a kind of flippant remark about pardons, and pardons have nothing to do with the guidelines, I recognize, but you did say we get to, get your ivory tower perspective from a law professor. I mean, you've been paying attention to what's happening, and because we're talking about fraud cases right now, that seems to predominantly be the pardons we're seeing in there. Millions and millions of dollars of fraud. In one case I just read, I think it was $1 billion of fraud. And I just wanted to get your perspective, your high level perspective on what the fuck.
Well, I mean, it's clear we have a president who I think, has never been anything other than transactional. And he came to discover, perhaps because he's got, especially these days, more of his fans running other aspects of the government than he did the first term, that he can be transactional with the pardon power and also just, whatever serves his parochial interests, whatever those might be. And so we're getting him using that power in a way that understandably, but I would ultimately say problematically, is leading folks to talk about we need to amend the Constitution and put some more restraints in there. Mark Osler on our Substack actually wrote a lovely essay analogizing the pardon power to a vintage Jaguar, basically saying it makes you feel terrible to see somebody drive it so horribly and crash into things, but that's
I
not a
like
reason to
that.
give up on, fancy sports cars, right? And so
Yeah.
I don't see it as an indictment of the pardon power as much as of the person using it in the kind of transactional way he currently is. I also think, though, and this is something I guess I have for both of you, I would think as an advocate working on white collar cases, I'd be bringing that pattern to bear in my sentencing advocacy because I'd be highlighting the fact that, boy, public perceptions of the seriousness of this offense is probably going down given that the president is here, suggesting that these folks are already redeemed or redeemable, notwithstanding these huge dollar amounts. And so, why
Yeah.
should my guy get, a decade or more when folks who have done so much worse have gotten these breaks? I think it creates opportunities for sensible advocacy. Where it fits in sort of the overall mosaic of justice, well, that's even above the ivory tower
Yeah.
pay grade. So
Yeah, do you rate that's such an important point, and I can't remember who I asked that to, if it was a judge or something. Would that be a legit argument? And the
Judge
person
Gertner.
was it, yeah, and
Yeah,
oh,
it was
thank
Judge
you.
Gertner.
And
Yep.
she wasn't super receptive to that in the sense that I think her basic proposition was just because these folks aren't showing respect for the law doesn't mean I should disregard
Right.
the
Right.
law.
That's
And I understand that, but I will say this, one of the 3553 factors is the need to promote respect for the law. And how, I don't know how you promote respect among the masses of people that are going to be sentenced in front of these people who don't have millions of dollars to pay political action committees or fancy lawyers who, are facing time and who have never been given a break in their life and never will. So, in terms of the general public, I think that this pardon thing is promoting massive disrespect. I don't
well,
know
yeah.
how that translates into a benefit to our run-of-the-mill
Well,
clients.
here's where always the 3553A factors have so much opportunity for argument. Because I think another thing that I perceive a number of white collar cases bring up is this sense of, well, we kind of know this guy is never going to do it again, but we need to send a message, right? These are high profile people and they're rich people, and we got to make sure, we show the deterrent effect of the law. And I would think in the context of a president pardoning a bunch of folks that gets a lot more attention than, sentencing number 24, in the middle of a year, you can make an argument, look, you're not going to be able to send a message that's anywhere comparable to the different message the president is sending through the use of his pardon power. So, don't see that as a legitimate goal under these sets of circumstances. And again, it's just another variation on really good advocates can think through what may serve their client's interest in a particular case. And of course, the individual judge is going to be very different. That's the other thing to not lose sight of. Every judge takes their 3553A authority in slightly different ways and has different concerns as they look at individual cases. And so I think that's again where it's I see it as something that ought not be ignored, something that could be leveraged in a variety of ways in the right kind of case. But it doesn't surprise me
Yeah.
whether it's Judge Gertner or others who would be like, well, I just don't think it's appropriate for me to basically hope that
Yeah.
two wrongs make a right, right?
And I hope no one was offended by my ivory tower comment. And just for the record, that came from you. You said you use those words. I would not say those.
As I
But
do and
okay.
proudly, right? That's my
Okay,
that's
good.
my that's my insulation from ever if I say things that are practitioners are like, what's he talking about? We don't the world doesn't really work that way. And I just remind folks, well, I sit up here in this ivory tower and pontificate because that's
That's
what they pay me to
awesome.
do.
Mark, I think there's this, and I'm not, this may come out sounding tongue in cheek, but I'm pretty serious when I say this. Is there a way to weave in these pardons into your statistical analysis? In other words, these are the guideline sentences, but when you factor in the actual amount of time that was done by people who have gotten pardons, wouldn't that potential, I don't know if it's a significant
Well, yeah,
sample, but wouldn't
actually,
it
no.
bring the numbers down?
Yeah, I actually worked with a Washington Post reporter on this. The J6 pardons actually had a real effect on lowering the average sentence
Yeah.
for obstruction of justice cases under, I think it was 2J
Okay.
1.2 or something like that,
All
that
right.
that particular guideline. But yeah, certainly that particular mass pardon did have a real
Yeah.
world effect on the statistics. Um, but as far as the white collar ones, they might, because there have been so many, and the
Yeah.
universe of high dollar white collar
Yeah.
sentencings is
Yeah.
rather small. Those could start having a real
Yeah.
world effect too.
And if you look at the sentence imposed versus the sort of de facto variance that they got, if
Oh
they served
God,
no time or
geez,
4 months or
yeah,
something on it, go to
yeah.
sentencing stats if you want very, very granular, very specific sentencing analysis. What a good plug for the new year. I don't even get any
Thank you.
kickbacks for that, FYI. Just full disclosure. Anywho, so let's talk about. So this is an interesting one. I'm going to kick it off with Professor Berman because what they're doing is proposing a bunch of specific offense characteristics. Now, let me set this up for people who don't know the nitty gritty of this. Every guideline has a base offense level and then has built in called SOC, specific offense characteristics. So fraud is a perfect example. We've been talking about it for the last 20, 30 minutes. The base offense level may be 6 or 7 or 8 under the guidelines, but then if you look at the loss, the specific offense level says if the loss is X, then enhance it by 10. If it's Y, enhance it by 20. So all these things are built in. So what I think we're talking about here, because they're proposing new ones, is because they did away with all the downward departures or upward departures, period, which is different. This is one of the reasons I hate the guidelines because it's way too complicated than it needed to be. So they uncomplicated them by getting rid of departures, but it sounds like they're going to take some of those scraps that they wiped off the table and try to incorporate them in a new way as specific offense characteristics. Am I reading that right?
I think that's right, and I think that goes to what I was talking about a little bit before, that their own elimination of departures may make them feel not quite duty bound, but that some of the nuance that they may have thought was captured in just general departure guidance and language may now need to be captured better in actual guideline specifics. And, part of that, although not all of the proposals that are now up for debate are about downward adjustments, but there are certainly some there that seem to be suggesting, look, we get it. There are versions of fraud offenses, particularly where it's not the, ultimate Netflix version of a criminal mastermind who's calculating it every minute and stealing as much money as he or she can, but actually there are a lot of circumstances that really are kind of mitigated by sort of by the very nature of who's committing the offense and how they're committing it, that the guidelines ought to reflect, given that, as I mentioned before, almost all the guidelines historically have been upward adjustments.
Yeah.
Like you say, in a we start with the base offense level and then we get all these specific offense characteristics. But I think, and it's been a while since I've run the numbers, but basically there were 700 some odd adjustments and 695 of them were upward adjustments. And that's just not the reality. Not everything is aggravating. There
Yeah.
are mitigating realities, and other than a role in the offense and acceptance of responsibility, there was really no set of classic guideline adjustments that went downward, and there were just hundreds upon hundreds of adjustments that went upward. And I'm glad they're sort of attending to this. The problem, of course, is there's so many, thank goodness the guidelines are advisory, because then there's still the opportunity for advocates to press. And I do worry to some degree, and we'll see this, maybe we want to talk about it with the big one, what I see as the biggest one, which is sort of post-offense rehabilitation, that as you turn these things into guidelines, they can get encrusted with law, and often the worst cases make the biggest law, right? So somebody sort of says, well, I didn't commit another crime, so I must have had great post-offense rehabilitation. And then a court goes and says, no, that doesn't count. And you know what? Doing all these other things isn't enough either. It's got to really be something special. And I worry a little bit, and this goes to kind of the, again, sort of ivory tower-ish, departures versus guideline story, that once something becomes a guideline, it becomes, encrusted with law. And prosecutors are historically better at making sure the law gets encrusted in their favor. So that's something to be keeping an eye on, even as we start seeing guidelines that look better from a defense perspective in terms of building more mitigation into the basic rules of sentencing.
Mark, in your outline that you so diligently prepared for this, under post-offense rehabilitation adjustments
Yes.
that Professor Berman was talking about, you wrote in brackets, "love it" with three exclamation points. Why do you
Yeah.
love it with three exclamation points?
Well,
This
because
possible.
to Professor Berman's point, downward adjustments are kind of a rarity,
Yeah.
and I will grab every downward adjustment that I can. And and to be honest, I mean, the post offense rehabilitation is something that's all routinely argued, and unfortunately routinely dismissed usually as a ground for a downward departure in the old nomenclature, or downward variance. But I agree with what Professor Berman said, that this is going to be very hard to really develop as its own guideline. But nonetheless, I take this as a real positive, and it is something that the Supreme Court, I think it was Pepper, and I can't remember, there's maybe one other case that had discussed post-offense rehabilitation that could be taken in consideration for, I think it was like compassionate release or something along those lines. But at
Hmm.
any rate, it's a recognized ground,
Yeah.
and I'm glad that the commission is developing it as best it can into some
Well,
formal departure or adjustment.
this one jumped out at me because it's so in the wheelhouse of what we do, just developing the narrative. But
Yeah,
I think the devil's going to be in the details. I would hate to
yeah,
see a list of specific criteria that if you didn't meet these specific elements, because it's such a vast
yes,
subject. There's so many different ways you could argue that a person has rehabilitated themselves. So, we'll
Well,
have to see. Yeah.
and
Go
I
ahead.
want to add here, and it's somewhat overlaps, but as again, we're, as much as I'm a fan of let's get more mitigation into the guidelines, there's a risk that becomes then the only way to get these factors well considered. And so we look
Right.
at like acceptance of
Exactly.
responsibility, and over
yeah, right,
time, there's a desire, rightly so, to say, well, this is extraordinary acceptance of responsibility, and that should get
right,
more
Yes.
than what the guidelines provide for. And there are some advocates in some cases and some judges that kind of recognize that, but then there can often be an instinct, and certainly I think it's the prosecutor's instinct. Oh, you're already getting credit for that. You don't
Mm.
get to argue for any more. And I think one of the things that will be really important as this gets debated by the commission, as we advocate for it to adopt some of these mitigating factors, is whether it's in the commentary or just in the sort of zeitgeist of how these get developed, that it be well understood. Okay, this is one way to quantify it, but doesn't cover every case. And there quite possibly could be cases in which extraordinary post-offense rehabilitation should get a lot more credit than
Yeah.
just the two or the four or however many levels down the commission might be inclined to give it.
Well, if I were a saucy law student of yours sitting in the ivory tower in your class having this discussion, I might just say, Professor Berman, I think you made a very good case for just dumping this under 3553 and being done with it.
I mean, I certainly think that if these things don't actually get enacted or don't get enacted in kind of the way that some advocates hope they are, there's the silver lining of, you know what, that may prevent
Yeah.
it from getting,
Yeah.
subject to limitations that the 3553A factors don't inherently have. But again, this
Yeah.
is one of
But
the ones that
but
both
this goes to
Dana.
the I'm sorry to interrupt, but this goes to the downside about getting rid of downward departures now, because this will be unwritten. It won't be in the guidelines then
Yeah.
if it's just a
Yeah. I do
3553A
think
factor.
this
So
is weird because now I'm taking the opposite position, but I do think, assuming it's not limiting, that having it memorialized in black and white in the guidelines is an affirmation that this really matters.
exactly.
And it's
Exactly.
bittersweet from my perspective because the sweet part is it's always been part of our sentencing philosophy to instill in a client that what you do matters now, and saying you're sorry it is not as important as doing and
Right.
showing and making the changes in your life and making sure the judge understands, because ultimately that's how you demonstrate acceptance of responsibility, by doing the work.
And
um,
as you guys know well or may know well, and I think this is something to never lose sight of, the instinct of, oh, we can get that through a judge through 3553A works great in the courtrooms and with the judges that are very anti-guideline. But there are a whole bunch of judges out there that are very pro-guideline, and it's going
yeah,
to be very important in those courtrooms to not just be able to make the
yeah,
argument, the guideline argument, but to be working with prosecutors to put a deal together that writes that into the deal to get this reduction. And so again,
yeah,
it's a part of where law
yeah.
can be awfully helpful when you have certain folks who are focusing on law rather than discretion in particular settings.
The bitter of the bittersweet is that is for my clients who are in pretrial custody. They really have no meaningful opportunity to demonstrate
Yep.
post-offense rehabilitation because there's a lack of programming and things like that. So the practice pointer I always say is there's this is fundamentally what we call a redemption story. How have you redeemed yourself from the bad choices you've made? And if you can't show a present redemption story of rehabilitation, you need to begin writing a future redemption story, and do the hard work of what is your plan for when this is behind you, and what changes in your life have you really put a lot of effort into trying to set up, whether it's a place to live or a new job or treatment, doing RDAP, or just a demonstrated commitment to making fundamental change. But it's much harder for folks that are in custody. Anyway,
Yeah.
so we have, there's going to be a push to simplify a lot of the specific offense characteristics. I think we can move on from that because I want to spend our last time talking about a couple of things that aren't specifically on the docket, but a couple of things. Professor Berman, you think maybe 2026 will have some more different amendments that might come down the pike. What are your thoughts on that?
So, two things that I'm giving a little attention to is the acquitted conduct guideline that had been written a couple years ago, which is a big deal and is worth its own podcast discussion, was written in such a vague way that we see cases, specifically a very high profile case involving Sean Diddy Combs, where a judge is quick to say, well, I'm not supposed to use acquitted conduct unless it's related to these other offenses, and I think I can here, no problem calculating the guidelines. And of course, there's also the ability to use 3553A as well, which the judge did in the Diddy case. I'm focused on it because I know the attorneys involved have been bringing an expedited appeal to the Second Circuit, and I've been working on a possible amicus brief, just trying to make sure that the guideline be given the effect I think it should have, which is to actually exclude acquitted conduct and to
Right.
not read the exception to that too broadly. We'll see if the Second Circuit moves as quickly as the lawyers want them to, because Sean Combs has already served, I think, a year and a half, and it may moot out over time. But that's a high profile setting for an interesting variation on this acquitted conduct issue that we've talked about for a long time, and the court has played footsie with, particularly the Supreme Court. And speaking of the Supreme Court, they also had argument last month on the compassionate release guideline and how the courts have been applying that in various ways. And I expect we'll get a ruling based on the oral argument. It may not be a particularly pro compassionate release ruling coming from the Supreme Court. And if it throws
Just
dirt on the
just just like give me the nutshell. What's the issue that
so
this court's taking up?
there's two cases they took up. One involves whether legal claims that could be in a 2255 petition, a habeas petition, could also be used in a compassionate release motion setting. And then the more fundamental one for what the commission's done is the commission wrote a guideline that said changes in the law under certain limited circumstances are proper bases for compassionate release, and the Supreme Court seemed quite adverse to that articulation of what could be extraordinary and compelling circumstances. Now we'll see what they ultimately say. But the reason I really bring it up, especially with the quorum issue I'm concerned about, is if the Supreme Court were to strike down part of that guideline and then there's not a quorum that can fix the guideline,
Yeah.
that could be its own kind of problem. Or to flip it another way, and this goes to some of the data and law things we've been talking about all hour. If they strike down the guideline, I hope there'll be an effort to still expand the compassionate release guideline based on the experience we've had to date of a whole bunch of other factors influencing lower courts on sentence reductions. And so, it's just other ways in which, whether it's circuit courts interpreting guidelines that have recently been changed or the Supreme Court, there's always a need to keep an eye on what the courts are doing in response to the way the commission has been doing its job.
I don't know if have any of you ever heard of or read the book A Second Chance by
That's Judge Block's
yeah.
book, right? Yeah.
Yes, I'm listening to it right now, but it's so much about compassionate release and how
Mm.
grateful he is that he has a chance to revisit some of these sentencing decisions, especially the ones that resulted in ridiculously long sentences.
One thing
Uh,
that was very interesting about the Supreme Court argument, especially against, watching from the ivory tower decades upon decades of Supreme Court work here, is in the guidelines era, there very much was a sense, and I think a right sense, that the Supreme Court thought the district judges were put upon and that they needed to, I think about the Kuhn ruling expanding departure authority. I think about some of the post-Booker rulings as well of like, hey, these district courts, they should have the authority to do sensible sentencing, and circuit courts stop limiting what they're doing. I'm getting a sense that this current court kind of is like, all right, the pendulum swung too far now. I'm a little worried if these district courts can, for any reason, some of the oral argument was about, well, what if a judge just says, I didn't like having to impose that mandatory minimum, and I think
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
bad idea, and so I want to reduce the sentence now. That's not a proper reason for compassionate release, is it, counsel? And honestly, the argument wasn't as sophisticated as I would like it to have been, which is, well, those mandatory minimums kind of suck. It's not a terrible
Yeah.
way to do things, but it's kind of notable, I think, that we don't have quite the same concern about overreach from the legislature or the circuit courts. Now there's a little bit of a concern about maybe district judges are getting too far ahead. And I wonder, and this is the last part of that, that all the other docket is influencing them a little bit. I don't know if folks are following closely that seems to be the theme of the interim docket or the emergency docket. There's a sort of the courts like worried that district judges are granting too many injunctions or getting too involved in these things sort of too quickly. And I worry a little bit that that may color their own willingness to allow district judges to do what I think the statute ought to be understood to allow them to do, which is decide what they think are extraordinary and compelling
Yes.
reasons to
Yeah.
sentence them.
Right.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the last thing on your list that you thought might be interesting would be appeal waivers. What's happening with, because that's the bane of our
Oh
existence. And
yeah.
one of the reasons why we counsel often for just to plead straight up, don't enter a plea agreement that makes you give up all your rights to appeal. But I didn't know there was anything afoot.
Yeah, there's a Supreme Court case. I forget all the details of it, including the name, but there's a pending case that they took up just about a month and a half ago, and so all the briefing's not in, that deals with what does an appeal waiver cover? And it's not clear to me. I'm not confident this court is going to say appeal waivers are never blessed, but it does seem to at least present an opportunity for the court to put more limits on appeal waivers and what it can reach because they took up an appeal from a circuit ruling that was basically like the only thing that you can appeal if you have an appeal waiver is if you're outside of the statutory range or there's some kind of bribery or something else that's just so clearly outside the realm of lawful process. And so, as is often the Supreme Court instinct, if they took this up, they may want to say more than what the lower court doctrines have been there. My sense is, most of the circuit courts have been very pro appeal waiver with very limited exceptions. And so I'm hopeful, maybe foolishly hopeful from the ivory tower, that this court might be a little bit more inclined to build in some more inherent limitations on how broad appeal waivers are. But we're going to have to see that, and the argument I think won't be until March of next year, and we won't get an opinion probably till June. But there's at least reason to be hopeful that maybe something's afoot there if you don't like where existing law lays.
And I think the case that Professor Berman is talking about is Hunter versus United States. The court just granted cert on that on October 10th. And the issue is whether the only permissible exceptions to a general appeal waiver are for claims of ineffective assistance of counsel or that the sentence exceeds the stat max, and whether an appeal waiver applies when the sentencing judge advises the defendant that he has a right to appeal and the government does not object. But I think it's that first prong that may be the
Mm.
really interesting one, whether the only permissible exceptions to a general appeal waiver are for claims of IAC or that the sentence exceeds the stat max. And that kind of reminds me of the Class case. This was a few terms ago where the Supreme Court held that an appeal waiver does not preclude claims that go to the constitutionality of the statute of conviction. You could still challenge that statute of conviction on an as applied basis. That doesn't waive that, which I thought was really interesting and could be
I
helpful.
assume in the Hunter case that you're talking about, there was an issue there that they wanted to appeal but could not. And do you know if that what that issue was that they
Yeah,
were
I
trying?
don't know that
Okay.
particular.
Well,
Yeah,
looks like we got a subject for a new podcast. And, this is the thing. I like to, there's a lot of proposed changes and things, and some of them are more significant in terms of how they affect our daily practice. And I think the appeal waiver is definitely one of them. We deal with
yeah.
that in every single case that's a plea. So I'll be interested to keep an eye on that. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. So this is it. We're going to land this plane, but here's how I decided it'd be fun to land. You are hanging out on the beach. A bottle washes up on shore. You, for some inexplicable reason, start rubbing it, and a genie pops out. But the only wishes you can ask for are changes to the guidelines, and you can't ask for the guidelines to be done away with altogether. What and so I'm gonna give you three wishes, but even if you want to just tell me your top wish, if you had that bottle, what would it be?
I'll give you two wishes that are going to sound very ivory towerish, but are exactly the way I run. So one would be to have everybody unknowingly but consistently just apply the very first set of guidelines that were enacted back in 1987. Because I think it would be fascinating to watch the system function with the original guideline book, which was about a third of the size of the current guideline book, and clearly was good enough for government work back then. And so I would find it fascinating to watch that transpire to just see how different the outcomes and the conversations would be. Again, imagining that it's still advisory. I wouldn't want to get rid of that, but just to see folks not realize they were using the earlier model, and my sense is it would have much lower ranges called for because there weren't as many new enhancements put in place. And then in the similar vein, but we can keep the current book if we want. This will be number two, to cut the sentencing table in half across the board. So everything else stays the same, but
I
just
like that.
the range of sentences are half what they are right now. And I think if we did just that, we'd find a heck of a lot more compliance with the guidelines,
Yep.
so to speak, a lot more within
Yeah.
guideline sentencing. And that would prove to me two things: that actually it's not the actual guidelines that are the problem as much as just the severity of what they produce
Yeah.
is really what is
Yeah,
causing
that's a
so
good
much
one.
consternation. And so,
Well,
That's a good one.
on that
All
same
right.
vein, then, if I had my wish, that the guidelines would go back to first principles, data, and
Yeah.
they would revise the guidelines based upon data, based upon two big data points, if you will. One is actual judicial practice, and I think this would go to what Professor Berman said, because if they cut the table in half, then you're going to have a hell of a lot of compliance, statistically speaking. You're not going to have all these variances and stuff. And the second thing is something that the commission has never done, even though it was part of the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984, is take into consideration prison capacity. The commission has never ever done that. The commission has published like little observations about what particular amendments might have in terms of impact on the number of beds, but they've never taken into consideration in terms of reducing sentencing or sentences for particular types of offenders or across the board based upon actual prison capacity and what's going on there. So those would be the two big things: is you actually using the data to help evolve the guidelines the way it was originally intended and designed to be or to do.
Pretty
just
good.
to finish this up, I would also then wish that the genie had a better life than to only be able to grant guideline wishes. Because I'm sorry, as genies go, that's a pretty crappy genie life.
Well, it's my hypothetical, Professor.
And I loved it. I loved it.
And
Yes.
don't you want to know my wishes?
Sure.
Yes.
Okay. Well, you guys' wishes are great. I would say, first of all, use of a computer in child porn
Oh yeah.
cases. The enhancement for that. Fuck off with that. Excuse my
Yeah.
French. And I would love to see something baked in the cake as it relates to developmental disabilities and intellectual disabilities.
Yeah.
Autism is on my mind front and center. And more probation. Your idea of cutting the chart in half is a brilliant one, but I want to see half that chart just be probation,
Yeah.
before we even get to the term. So how's that?
That's the way it used to be, by the way, Doug.
I
That's the
know.
way before the guidelines. It was like that.
Over 50% of
Over
people got probation.
60%.
Yeah,
Over 60%.
people cannot be reminded of that often enough
Yeah.
because, let's go back to that. Well, all right, so let me wrap this up by saying Happy New Year. I think this podcast drops right after the first of the year, so I hope you had one and I hope you have one. Check out Berman's blog in its new home, there will be a link in the show notes. I also want to talk about Drugs on the Docket, which is a podcast produced by the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center there that you're deeply involved in, and Mark and I have been on it a couple times, and it's really, really good. I just want people to be aware that all the episodes are out. It's on all the podcast platforms. I'm going to put a link there, and of course, sentencingstats.com. And that's it. Thanks for being here. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Happy New Year, and be well. Everybody be well.
Yes, indeed. Happy.
That's it for today, but before we go, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you to you, the listener, for spending time with us today getting set for sentencing. Whether you're a lawyer, someone who could use the help, or maybe you're just a true crime buff who loves the inside scoop on how this whole thing works. If you're interested in knowing more about what I do, mitigation videos, case consults, live teaching, on-demand educational content, books, articles, all of it, please visit www.dougpassonlaw.com. I'm Doug Passon. Until next time, hang in there. Wait a minute, that's a stupid way to sign off on a podcast about sentencing. Hang in there. What's the matter with you, man? I guess they call that gallows humor. Sorry. All right. Well, I will see you next time on Set for Sentencing. Bye-bye.